Welcome to Tech Intersect. I'm your host, Tanya Evans, and my life and work exist at the heart of law, business, and technology. Yeah, I've earned a few fancy titles and degrees over the years, but the bottom line is I'm a writer, speaker, teacher, and lifelong learner, and I'm really excited that you've joined me on this journey. So what is Tech Intersect? Well, it's authentic, empowering conversations with really interesting guests who demystify complex topics to prepare you for the future. Because your future is now. And it exists where law, business, and tech intersect. Get ready to listen, learn, and leverage. Let's get started. Chris Odinet is an associate professor of law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law and is an affiliate faculty member with the Tom E. Love Division of Entrepreneurship and Economic Development in the University of Oklahoma Price College of Business. I invited him on the show to discuss his work that focuses on the intersection of law, credit, and technology with a specific emphasis on financial technology or FinTech innovations in lending. His book titled Foreclosed: Mortgage Servicing and the Hidden Architecture of Home Ownership in America was published recently by Cambridge University Press and is particularly insightful on these points. His recent work in crypto lending and consumer data also explores the potentially discriminatory impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning on FinTech lending. So this is a really interesting discussion that I know you'll enjoy. Time to listen, learn, and leverage. So let's get started. So I am really fortunate and excited to have Professor Chris Odinet join us today to talk about a really interesting area in FinTech or financial technology, and he'll tell us a little bit more about what that means when we focus on consumer lending in that space, and also some inclusion, social impact issues that come up a lot in the blockchain space that have a particular and decided focus in the financial technology space, where even when people start to build projects that don't have a discriminatory intent, may have a disparate impact on marginalized communities. So we're going to hit some really interesting topics. But first, I welcome you, Professor Odinet, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Professor Evans. It's entirely my pleasure. I'm super thrilled to be here. It's such a treat. I'm a fan of the podcast, and I'm excited to get to share a little bit of my work with your audience today.
Excellent. So let's dive right in. And first, tell us a bit about your background, how you found your way to the blockchain, crypto, and FinTech space. And if you had, what we call in the ecosystem a rabbit hole moment. I'm always fascinated how people found themselves in this space.
Sure. So when I was in practice after law school, I did a lot of real estate work, commercial real estate work, and a lot of commercial financial work, secure transactions, selling of businesses, buying of businesses type financial work. And so it was really interesting to learn what I like to think of as sort of the plumbing of the economy in practice. And then when I joined the academy, my focus sort of shifted from the business side of that plumbing to the everyday person side of that plumbing. So I'm thinking the consumer side. It was also the timing of my development, my professional development was right after the financial crisis. So I graduated from law school in 2010. So I was in law school during the crisis and sort of seeing the aftermath of it up close right after. So when I joined the academy in 2013, I was really interested in residential mortgage lending. Of course, that was the big hot topic. Foreclosures, what was happening in the sort of keeping homeowners in their homes and loss of homes and bank bailouts. And it led me to write a book on mortgage servicers, sort of the mortgage middlemen, which is really a deep dive into residential housing finance in America. And when I finished that project, the natural outgrowth of that was, okay, well, I guess I've sort of studied what's going on in how everyday Americans finance the purchase of homes, but how are Americans financing the purchase of everything else? Because wages were stagnant and the economy was still struggling. And that really got me looking at consumer lending or consumer borrowing, consumer debt, household debt. And what I discovered as I was doing that research was that there was a huge move to online debt, to online lending, and this blossoming world of tech companies, Silicon Valley companies, getting into the finance business. And they've become known as financial technology companies, or what has become sort of the buzzword, FinTech. And I was just fascinated by what these companies were doing. I was also fascinated and continue to be in how these companies and their business models fit or don't fit with what is, a pretty long-standing regulatory legal framework for banks and lenders in the United States. And what does it mean when a tech company wants to be more like a bank and do banking like things? And does the law adequately contemplate that and deal with the problems that might be similar to what banks deal with and what might be very different?
It's really fascinating because, as you say in Consumer Bit Credit and FinTech Lending, your article, and what's the name of your book as well?
Oh, sure. It's called Foreclosed, Mortgage Servicing and the Hidden Architecture of Homeownership in America. It came out in Cambridge Press this past February.
Perfect. I'll definitely drop a link to that in the show notes because I really want the listeners to have all the information that we're going to talk about today, where we can only have a short amount of time. But this is a really fascinating area that has significant consequences for the reasons that we will continue to flesh out. And one thing that you noted as you were fully immersed in financial issues before specifically FinTech, right after the financial crisis began, that 2008, 2009 era, when there was also a crisis of confidence in trusted institutions, right? These trusted intermediaries we speak about a lot in the ecosystem. And you say something interesting that is in some ways really open-ended, but gets to the sweet spot as well, that in that article, Consumer Bit Credit and FinTech Lending, quote, the digital economy is changing everything, including how we borrow money. And then you go on to explain that a wave of online firms, as you mentioned, called FinTech lenders, have filled the space left vacant by traditional financial institutions. So can you say a little bit more about how those institutions failed us? And it's across the board, right? Not just on the lending side, but the ratings agencies. There was enough issue or problem to go around for all of those trusted, quote unquote, intermediaries, and how this new wave of lenders is filling the void left by traditional financial institutions.
Absolutely. And I guess I can't emphasize enough the ways that the traditional banking sector was, in some, I guess, generously was complicit in the financial crisis.
Right,
And I
right. That's generous.
or a little bit more honestly caused it. But specifically with regard to the issue that I'm talking about, after the financial crisis, it was mortgage lending, which is a type of consumer lending, but
Right.
it was mortgage lending that really was at the heart of the financial crisis. And it was many banks and some non-banks too, but many banks, many sort of trusted names in the American economy where we keep our deposit accounts and our savings accounts and where we save up for college. They were the ones who were either directly by making subprime, very predatory loans, or indirectly by funding and owning other companies that were, the countrywides that were originating these loans. So after the financial crisis, there was a huge backlash. In fact, probably one of the biggest examples of that was the enormous settlement that all of essentially every major bank in the United States entered into with the attorneys general of almost every state, then the Justice Department and the Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level to account for what had been many, many years of predatory lending and really negligent activity in how they were servicing loans, meaning
Right.
the way they were dealing with homeowners in distress. And that's really what my book is about. So they really pulled back on consumer lending. And to the extent there was really any consumer lending going on at all after 2008, it's mostly credit cards or home equity lines of credit. And, those carry very high interest rates. They're sort of high yielding. So that's been the preference. But after the crisis because of just long periods of stagnant wages. I think it's worth noting for your listeners, and I think it's just sort of a good observation for people to remember just generally, and that is that household debt is higher today than it has ever been in the history of the country,
Wow.
including at its height in 2007. So household debt is higher right now than it has ever been. In the second quarter of 2019, it was at 13.86 trillion. So
Wow.
that's a combination of auto loans, mortgage loans, credit cards, student loans, everything else. So there's a lot of borrowing. And the type of borrowing that many Americans need tend to be relatively smaller amounts. Although unemployment remains low, over half of Americans work in very low wage jobs with only median incomes of about $18,000 per year. That was some
Right.
new data that came out just last month by the Brookings Institution. So even though since the financial crisis, household incomes are up about 15%, but housing costs are up 26%, and medical expenses are up 33%, and tuition for college is up 45%. So Americans are having a very difficult time, making ends meet, and the way that they've dealt with that is through borrowing. And that is really where these fintech lenders come in. These fintech lenders are filling that little gap of providing relatively small dollar short-term loans to Americans who need to try and make ends meet. There was a study, a couple of studies that came out last year and the year before, showing that over half America, roughly half to a little over half of American households cannot handle an unexpected expense of anywhere between $400 and $500.
Wow. Yeah.
So these online lenders, these are not banks. They're basically tech companies that are getting into the finance business, have come to fill this niche market of unsecured consumer loans. And just to give you some numbers, I think they're really sort of stark. In 2013, so not too long after the financial crisis, in terms of the market share of unsecured personal loans, so just a personal loan, it's not secured by a car, a house, or anything, just a personal loan,
Mm-hmm.
about 40% of those loans were made by banks, 31% were made by credit unions, another 24% were made by, those finance companies, your payday lenders, your kind of brick and
Yes.
mortar finance companies, but only 5% were made by these online lenders. Let's fast forward to 2018. Now, 28% of those types of loans are made by banks. So that's down from 40% in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
21% by credit unions, a 10% drop. 13% by these finance companies, but a whopping 38%, up from 5% in 2013, are made by these online lenders. And in fact, there was some data that just came out in March of this year by Experian, and Experian said that the amount of unsecured consumer loans made by these online lenders nationwide is now at 50%. So half of all of these loans are made by these online lenders. So that's showing that these tech companies are really meeting a demand that the
Mm-hmm.
traditional financial sector is not meeting.
You love listening to podcasts, but have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? Maybe you want to build a brand, grow your business, or are looking for an excuse to talk about your favorite hobby. Whatever your reason for making a podcast, Buzzsprout is the place to start. Since 2009, Buzzsprout has helped over 300,000 people launch their own podcasts. Buzzsprout walks you step by step through the whole process and will give you powerful tools to start, grow, and monetize your podcast. Ready to get started? Click the link in the show notes to get our free step-by-step guide to starting your podcast today.
Wow, those statistics are stark indeed. And when I think about the meteoric rise in 5 years' time and keeping up that particular pace, how quickly, my mind is going about how they are accessing uh, to consumer. I guess they're the new intermediary, but they must make it very, very easy to do. I can imagine most of, not all of it is directly online line and automated by various functions, making it very easy to do these lower dollar amount loans, but probably at quite a clip in terms of interest rate. But it may not have to be as high as the credit card rates. Credit card rates are off the charts right now. So they're probably hitting the sweet spot between low interest banking and high interest credit cards to meet consumers where they are in ways that traditional financial institutions are still not touching post 2008, 2009. Interesting. But of course, this begs the question of what is the proverbial elephant in the room about how lending based on, and maybe you could talk a bit about the data that is relied upon by these fintech companies to issue these loans. Talk about that consumer data and how that might be regulated in the law, and how these lenders are regulated in this space, because you've also mentioned these are not banks per se, these are tech companies who have entered this particular market. So help me flesh that out a bit.
Sure, absolutely. So when it comes to getting a loan, the consumer applying for a loan, or really even a small business applying for a loan, but we'll use a consumer. For much of modern history in the United States, whether someone gets a loan and on what term that person gets a loan is largely driven by his or her credit score. And there are really two major types of credit scores in the US. We're all sort of familiar with them, the FICO score and the Vantage score. And some 90% of all lending decisions to consumers are driven by one of these scores. So they are very powerful and they're super important. And those scores, for your listeners, you might know a little bit about this, but maybe it's helpful to put some finer edges around it. The scores are created by using information contained in consumer reports, although we colloquially call them credit reports. And these are essentially files on individuals that are housed at the three major national credit reporting agencies, so Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And the information in these reports is what is used to create a score. But this information is very limited. So what type of information goes in someone's consumer report? So generally, it's going to be credit information. What kind of loans have you had in the past, or do you currently have? Have you paid them on time? Have you ever been late? In what amounts have they been? Any lawsuits against you? Any bankruptcies that you filed? Any foreclosures or any tax liens? This is the information, trade line information and public filing information that goes into a consumer report. So lenders use this information in combination with, what a borrower says their income is, or what their reoccurring liabilities or debts are, and how long they've lived in a particular place, to engage in the process of studying how creditworthy a borrower is. This is what's called underwriting.
Right.
So what we are seeing is a real change, a subtle change, but a certain change in underwriting by fintech companies, and the way that they are using both alternative data on the one hand and machine learning algorithms on the other. And this shift, as I mentioned, is largely driven by these tech firms entering the finance space, fintech firms. But I should also note that many mainstream financial institutions, many major banks are right now, we know this, they are investing in building up data science teams to do more of this type of work themselves in the future. The argument that is made is that alternative data and machine learning can create a more complete picture of a borrower's financial capacity, at least better than what existing methods like FICO and Vantage do. So I said alternative data is basically any information beyond that which was in those consumer reports that I just mentioned. So what would that include? Well, it's almost limitless, right? It could include where a borrower lives, text messaging habits, health records, what clubs they belong to, their education history, standardized test scores, your digital footprint, your social media activity. To give you an example, the CEO of FICO admitted that how many times a person says the word wasted in their social media profile probably has some value in predicting whether or not they're going to repay a debt. There was also an online lender called Zest Finance that several years ago submitted a patent application to try and patent its underwriting method. And that patent application is really interesting because it gave us a little window into the world of what some of these fintech companies are doing with their underwriting. A major problem, or not necessarily a problem, but it's just a reality of this sector, is that the underwriting methods, what type of alternative data is being used, that's all proprietary. So there's not really an easy way for researchers like me, and I'll talk about in a minute, even regulators in some sense, to know what's going into these algorithms. But this patent application revealed something. So there was a list of data points in the application. A lot of them were ones you would expect, things that you would find in a consumer report. But two things stood out to me. One was the stability of the individual's social network friend list or follower list. And the other thing was let me see if I can get this right, I want to quote it exactly, the topic and sentiment of social media posts. It reminded me of a statement that used to be on the website of a particular online lender. It said, all data is credit data.
Okay, that basically says it all.
So alternative data is only one part of the process, though. The other part is that machine learning algorithms process this borrower information with an aim toward finding hidden correlations between, seemingly irrelevant data points, like your shopping habits or what type of smartphone operating system you have, and a propensity to repay a loan. Now, of course, these correlations have high dimensionality, so they're really beyond what the human brain can detect. But the machine learning algorithm has the ability to analyze, first analyze training data, and then use that training. And so what would training data be? Training data would essentially be information about individuals who have repaid loans in the past, and then using that information to create some correlations, not causations, but correlations, and then using those connections, however distant and counterintuitive they may be, to analyze new borrower applications. And so the idea is that over time, the algorithm will perfect and improve its predictive power, although it is never concerned with why certain borrower characteristics are predictive. It just is concerned that there is some correlation, at all.
Right.
That, of course, raises, and what I and others have talked about in the past and sort of are writing about right now, are fair lending concerns and the opportunity for discrimination through the use of these types of alternative data and machine learning.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of Tech Intersect. Our conversation will continue in a moment, but first, a word on an exciting opportunity.
The Tech Intersect podcast is released to the public every Friday. But as an Advantage Evans member, you'll receive first listen access and live Tech Intersect Connect video chats. Premium members also receive a copy of my ebook, The Gen Xer's Guide to Upskilling in a Web 3.0 World, and unlimited access to the video chat replays and bonus episodes. My pro members, ready to leverage what they've listened to and learned, receive access to the Upskilling Self-Guided course and VIP group coaching calls. So as you can see, Advantage Evans membership adds substantial value to your podcast experience. And there are 3 ways to take advantage, see what I did right there, of all that the Tech Intersect podcast has to offer. So subscribe now, and let's listen, learn, and leverage together.
And now, back to the conversation.
So that's a critical point for sure. It was hard enough in more traditional models to ensure fairness in lending practices, going above and beyond what the usual and ordinary universe of information, to the fact that there's so much data that can be culled publicly and purchased. That really does raise concerns, because in the data science sphere and certainly in the coding spheres, when we think about garbage in, garbage out, we also have to think about discrimination in, discrimination out. So obviously the FinTech space is no exception. How does the law currently deal, or how might it deal normatively with instances of discriminatory lending by machine learning algorithms that use this alternative data to score borrowers?
So much to be said there.
Right.
So one, you totally hit it on the head. I mean, that's the big concern. I go to a lot of conferences where I get to talk to lawyers who represent a lot of these fintech companies or financial institutions that partner with them. And this is sort of the big concern. And to be more specific, the concern is about whether or not some of these underwriting methods could violate or lead to violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and Regulation B, which interprets it. And there are really two ways to prevail under a fair lending action under this particular statute. This statute, just for background, it prohibits discrimination in the lending and as well as in the marketing of credit based upon a number of protected factors, including race, gender, ethnicity. And when you bring one of these actions against a lender that you believe has violated the act, there are really two ways to prevail. One is by proving disparate treatment, to prove that there actually was intentional discrimination, which I will say is rather difficult to prove.
Right.
Most discriminators don't leave a big paper trail saying, "Aha, this is why I did it." But the other way, and what's proven to be the way that at least the CFPB, or at least in past years, has brought a lot of these actions, is through the disparate impact or disparate effect method. I'll sidestep the disparate treatment and this what's called the McDonough-Douglas burden shifting test for those claims, and instead just say a few things about the disparate impact analysis, which I think is more likely to be the model used by plaintiffs and regulators in this space.
Right.
So it's a burden shifting test. The plaintiff identifies some particular policy or practice of the defendant. So in this case, it would be the underwriting method. And then the plaintiff must also show a disparate impact on some sort of legally protected group. So it could be based on race, it could be based on gender. All you have to show is, well, you have to show that the impacted group feels the impact disproportionately, which means you'll need some sort of control group to compare them against. And usually expert testimony is how this is accomplished. And then after you do those two things, you identify the disparate impact and you identify the policy or practice, you have to show causation. So this is usually said to require more than just a statistical significance. You actually have to raise a causal inference. And to do that, and which has been a little bit of a problem in the law, is there has not been a ton of cases under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or at least appellate cases, to really flesh this out. So generally what lawyers and judges who deal with these cases have done is look to another area of law that prohibits discrimination where there has been a lot of activity and there are tons of cases, and that's in employment discrimination. So once these three elements are proven by the plaintiff, then the burden shifts to the defendant. And this is where I think it gets a little thorny when it comes to machine learning and alternative data, because the defendant can defeat the action by showing that, yes, despite the fact that this policy or practice might have caused this disparate impact on a legally protected class, doing so was justified by a legitimate business justification. So there was some legitimate business justification. Now, we don't really know much about the contours of that defense because, again, it was taken from an employment case, this Griggs versus Duke Power. And the idea there was that an employment policy or practice that has some disparate impact on a legally protected class can be fine as long as it has some manifest relationship to employment or job performance. Well, that doesn't really make for a perfect comparison here. So the best guidance we have is there is a 1977, which I think this really says how deeply in need we are of some regulatory or some congressional direction on how these types of claims are supposed to be analyzed, because this 1977 guidance from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency directed at national banks dealing with these sorts of cases says, well, national bank, if you're trying to prove your legitimate business justification, then the way that you do it is by showing, and I quote, that your policy or practice is statistically related to loan performance and has an understandable relationship to creditworthiness. Now, that's sort of interesting because if it has to have an understandable relationship to creditworthiness and you're using alternative data, is it sufficient for you to say, well, it turns out that people who use Apple operating systems as opposed to Android operating systems have a correlatively higher rate of repaying a loan? Does that have an understandable relationship to creditworthiness? What does operating system use really have to do with creditworthiness? How will a court deal with that? Well, is correlation enough, or is it really causation? Because it's really hard to say that your operating system causes you to default or not. You might be able to say there's a correlation between those types of users, but is that going to be enough? But even if a defendant is able to prove this, the burden shifts one more time back to the plaintiff to show, well, you could have used some other essentially underwriting method and you would have still achieved your business justification, but you would have caused no or less discrimination. So, how do you exactly do that when you're talking about a black box algorithm? Not, depending on what type of algorithm is being used to process this alternative data, you may or may not be able to know why the decision was made that was ultimately made. Decision tree algorithms, linear and logistical regressions, you can better understand what's happening. Artificial neural networks, not so much.
Right.
So, really the type of algorithm, and it may be the case that even the lender does not know exactly why the result that the underwriting program suggested came about. They'll be able to see the data that went in and the result that came out, but not necessarily what happened in the internal decision making. And in my view, sort of to step away from the trees and look at the forest, that sort of turns the whole burden shifting business justification alternative method framework, which has sort of uneasily worked or attempted to work for Equal Credit Opportunity Act claims, on its head.
Right, absolutely, because all of those decision points are done based upon the algorithm that is doing it better, faster, cheaper. And we don't fully understand or appreciate if it's not relational and you don't have those intermediate steps where, quote unquote, showing the work. We know that information goes in, there is an output of the best case scenario based upon the AI or the ML's processing of that information. And so that is challenging. That is challenging to be sure, given the whole dramatic impact of disparate impact. And if you have a good faith company who intends to do the right thing, how can they avoid that when artificial intelligence and machine learning is the critical component and the decision maker, right? And from a culpability point of view, where does the culpability lie?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, those are you've perfectly distilled, I think, the real problem. Not only how the law deals with this particular problem, but also how businesses should try and plan so that they can be compliant. There's an interesting and growing area of data science research called explainable AI, which is essentially creating algorithms to help understand other algorithmic decision making. And there's really been a ramping up of that because there's such a focus right now. And you can see this in Congress. I was in DC a couple weeks ago, and the chair of the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Financial Technology was speaking along with some other members of the broader committee, talking about the real need for explainability. If you are denied credit or you receive credit on terms different than what you applied for, you need as a borrower to be able to understand why that happens. And in fact, that's not really just sort of a normative wish. The law requires that. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act variously require adverse action notices that require lenders that make adverse decisions about someone's creditworthiness to tell that borrower why it is that we denied your credit or why you're receiving a more expensive loan than that which you applied for. You can imagine that if you're some sort of lender using complicated black box AI, you're not going to be able to comply with that very real legal requirement. And so there really is a lot of data science work going on right now to try and help these types of companies or companies that use these types of methods just at the bare minimum comply. But, I think even more broadly, we have to worry about not just being able to explain the decisions that we make, but also the type of information that goes in, right? So bad information going in is going to make bad decisions going out, even if our algorithm doesn't necessarily mean to discriminate.
Right.
So I think a good instance of that, just to make it very real and proven, are inaccuracies in current consumer reports. So in 2013, the Federal Trade Commission found that 23% of all credit reports had errors in them, and
Wow.
13% of them were material errors, which means that they would result in a denial of credit or charging of interest at a higher rate. Probably like a good example of this, even if you identify a problem on your credit report, it can be a terrible process to get it corrected. One example, TransUnion, one of the credit reporting agencies, it repeatedly reported bad debts of a woman named Judith L. Upton on the credit report of an entirely different individual named Judy Thomas. And in another, story, an Ohio resident discovered that her credit report inaccurately contained information on the debts of someone who lived in Utah. And it took her many years to finally get that corrected. But in the meantime, she was unable to refinance her mortgage, unable to get a car loan, or co-sign her child's student loans. So, even if you can buy into the ways to perfect the nature of underwriting by algorithm, we should still be worried about the inputs. And, biased information that goes in creates biased results going out, no matter how carefully you hone that algorithm.
Wow, this is definitely a series of cautionary tales, as this will continue to be a challenge to the law, problematic when you have disparate impact outcomes that have dramatic consequences for a person's life. Oftentimes, in your last example, is one of the best to highlight. By the time the damage is corrected, the damage has already been done in a substantial way that has dramatic impact on the quality of life for at least two generations from your last example. So one of the best ways to combat this, I think, is for people to have as much information as possible. And I'd love for you to tell people, as we come to a close, how they can connect with you and your work, or if you have any recommendations for additional reading. I have very curious and fabulous listeners who are lifelong learners like myself. So definitely tell us how they can connect with you, your work, and any recommended reading that you might have. If not, and you send it to me, I'll definitely drop it in the show notes as well.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me say thank you again for having me. It's been an absolute delight, and I'm so happy to be able to share this work with your listeners. So, feel free to contact me. I am on the faculty at the University of Oklahoma College of Law until the end of this academic year, and I actually will be headed to the University of Iowa. But you can find me. Thank you. You can find me on Twitter. It's just Chris Odinet, all one word. But you can go to my law school's website and find my email address. And as well as links to my research. But I will want to say, and then this will lead me to make a recommendation on reading, I do think there is a lot of promise in the use of alternative data in underwriting. I mean, I think we have well established in other literature that the FICO and the Vantage score is really a very weak model. We already know that over 80% of young adults between 18 and 19 are credit invisible. Credit invisible meaning they don't have credit scores at all. 30% of individuals living in low income neighborhoods were credit invisible. 15% had unscorable records. Even those living in moderate income areas have a combined invisible or unscored percentage of 30%, and middle income Americans have about 20%. So there are a lot of people that are shut out or disadvantaged under the current system. So alternative data may very well give a much better, more inclusive picture. And I recommend to your readers, there was a study that just came out in 2018, some researchers took a look at the digital footprint that was left behind by shoppers who used essentially a Wayfair type website in Germany that used digital footprint data to decide whether or not someone could buy something from this Wayfair company on credit. So these researchers compared the digital footprint. So just whether you used a smartphone or a tablet, your operating system, did you access the website through a paid ad or a search engine? What time of day did you do your shopping? And they matched that with loan default rates. They found that using just that very shallow, narrow amount of digital footprint data was just as predictive as using a credit bureau score. And when you combined the credit score with this digital footprint model, it was even more predictive. So that means that, potentially alternative data can be used to really expand the credit box in ways that the current way we do credit scoring just has not done it. But we need to sort of be careful about what that means, particularly on groups for which the current existing credit scoring model has always disadvantaged, like people of color, young Americans, and low-income Americans. So I'm happy to send you, Dean Evans, the link to that study. I think your readers might find it really interesting.
That's fantastic. And it also is a great reminder that technology, or technological tools are just that. What we do with them will determine the impact that they have and whether it will be positive, negative. Usually it's never polarized in that sense that there are good uses, quote unquote, socially beneficial, and those that are not. And hopefully through the use of these technologies, we will find our way to something that is more fair, more inclusive, and more reflective of the actual outcomes of a greater majority of people. So with that, Professor Chris Odinet, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Professor Odinet argues that the digital economy is changing everything, including how we borrow. Half of all online loans are made by online tech companies, not banks. They are meeting a demand that legacy financial companies aren't meeting. What consumer data is relied upon to make these loans? Well, 90% of decisions are driven by two major credit scores, FICO and Vantage, which comprise a traditional consumer report. But then there's the alternative consumer data, or ACD. What makes up your ACD in lending? Anything beyond the FICO or Vantage reporting, where you live, text messaging patterns, health records, clubs and associations, educational history, your digital footprint, social media activity, and more. Machine learning processes the information to analyze hidden correlations between seemingly irrelevant data points like shipping habits versus your propensity to repay a loan. A major concern is use of this information for discriminatory purposes or, even in good faith circumstances, a disparate impact. There's lots to unpack and consider in this episode, so take your time, figure out what it means for you, and, of course, until next time, continue to shine.
Stay in touch with host Tanya Evans via your favorite social media. On Twitter at Tech Intersect, and on Instagram via the handle Tech Intersect. This podcast has been produced by Stephanie Renee for Soul Sanctuary Incorporated.